What would happen if a boss secretly returned to the very store he built and discovered that his most honest employee was being pushed so hard they were ready to quit? The sound of a burger dropping to the floor echoed sharply in the cramped kitchen, a small, dry thud that somehow carried enough weight to shatter the last shred of pride in the young man who dropped it. The sandwich splattered across the stained tiles, sauce oozing out in sticky streaks that clung to the greasy floor. For a split second, all eyes flicked toward the mess, then darted away immediately, as if staring too long would drag them into the storm that was about to erupt. "Wanna cry? Go home and cry, don't put on a show here," Harlan Briggs snarled, each word landing like a hammer blow. The middle-aged man, his bald head gleaming with sweat, stood blocking the narrow walkway, one hand pressing against the metal prep table, his sharp gaze slicing through the air like a blade. He glared at the boy as if he were worthless, as if dropping that sandwich was the gravest of sins. Evan Cross stood frozen beside the prep station, his hands trembling, instinctively pulling close to his sides, his shoulders hunched, his breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts he dared not let be heard. Under the harsh neon light, his face looked so pale that the faint blue veins at his temple were visible. Evan didn't cry, didn't even speak. He just stood there, silent, a shadow ready to be swept away by the next gust of humiliation. Somewhere in the corner, the rhythmic sound of a knife chopping vegetables slowed for just a heartbeat, then resumed as if nothing had happened. No one dared to intervene. No one wanted to be dragged into this. Harlan's stare lingered on Evan, cold and sharp, stripping away whatever dignity the boy had left. "Pick it up. Actually, forget it. You can't do anything right anyway," Harlan scoffed before turning abruptly, his heavy footsteps grinding against the grimy tiles with a harsh, dry scrape. The rest of the kitchen remained silent, as though this was nothing more than a normal part of the workday. Evan knelt down slowly, his knee touching the cold, greasy floor, his shaky hands reaching to pick up the ruined burger, carefully gathering each piece as if even the filthy tiles deserved more respect than he did. At the far end of the kitchen, a man stood watching, his hands clenched tightly inside his pockets, knuckles whitening. Caleb Monroe, though no one here knew that name. They only knew Kyle Myers, the name printed on the cheap plastic tag pinned to his wrinkled shirt. Leaning casually against the dull gray wall, Caleb's eyes followed every movement Evan made. But this wasn't just observation, it was recognition. He saw himself in that boy, a reflection of who he was 15 years ago, a young man trembling, forced to kneel and pick scraps off the floor while some heartless manager spat insults at him like venom. Caleb inhaled slowly, forcing his face to remain calm. One wrong expression, one slip of anger, and weeks of careful planning would unravel in an instant. But inside his chest, his heartbeat pounded like a drum of war. He remembered why he was here, why he had disguised himself as an inexperienced new hire. Reports full of numbers had never been able to tell him the truth. Profit margins and efficiency percentages were just polished masks covering a rotten core. He had seen vague complaints about exhaustion, about abusive managers, about suffocating work environments driving employees to quit in droves. But witnessing this, seeing it with his own eyes, made it real. These weren't just statistics. These were real people, real faces, rough hands, silently enduring a system built on fear. His eyes lingered on Evan, still bent down, still gathering the ruined pieces of bread with hands trembling so badly that each scrap slipped from his fingers again and again. No one bent down to help. No one offered a word of comfort. Silence, here, had become survival. Caleb's gaze shifted toward Harlan, who now stood chatting casually with another worker, a smug grin on his face as if humiliating Evan was nothing more than routine. Caleb tilted his head slightly, a sharp glint flickering in his eyes. No one noticed, but in that moment, a silent promise was made. This would not happen again. Evan Cross would not be the last to kneel on this greasy floor, and Harlan Briggs would pay for every word, every look of contempt he had thrown like trash. Caleb drew in a slow breath, his fists tightening even harder inside his pockets to keep himself still, to wait for the right moment. But inside him, a storm had already begun to rise, and it wouldn't stop until everything rotten in this place was torn apart. That night, the warm yellow light in the third-floor office spilled silently onto the polished tile floor, reflecting the lone figure of a man sitting motionless at a wooden desk, covered in a thin layer of dust. Caleb Monroe sat still, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes fixed on an old silver-framed photograph resting in the corner of the desk. In the faded picture, a younger Caleb smiled brightly, one arm draped over the shoulder of an old sous chef. It was taken on the opening day of his very first bakery 10 years ago, a day when everyone knew his name, a day when every employee was treated like family. Caleb gripped the photo tightly, took a deep breath, then set it down so gently it was as if he was afraid of breaking a precious memory. He glanced around the spacious yet cold office, shelves stacked with financial reports, colorful charts neatly bound and arranged on the desk. All of these had once been his pride, proof of the success he had worked so hard to build. But now, every number felt like a stone weighing down his chest, dragging him into a sea of shame. When had he begun to drift so far from the very reason he started all this? The question echoed quietly in his mind, forcing him to close his eyes. Caleb remembered the early days vividly when he rolled up his sleeves in the kitchen, slicing every loaf of bread himself, wiping down every table, remembering each employee's name and the stories about their families. He had once promised himself that this company would never become a soulless machine, and yet here he was, in his own store, where a thin young man had been forced to kneel and pick scraps of bread off the greasy floor under the open contempt of a manager. He didn't need reports anymore, didn't need the sugar-coated explanations from the executive board. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. Caleb rose to his feet and walked toward the large mirror hanging near the window. The dim desk lamp cast soft shadows across his face, revealing faint lines at the corners of his eyes, strands of gray in his neatly trimmed hair, and a jaw hardened by years of responsibility. He ran a hand slowly across his face, staring into his own reflection as if searching for the younger version of himself he had lost somewhere along the way. His gaze slowly sharpened, like a blade being honed to a fine edge. Without hesitation, he moved to the wooden cabinet and pulled out an old duffel bag. Each item he packed was chosen carefully: a faded but clean polo shirt, a pair of slightly wrinkled khaki pants, an ordinary pair of sneakers, and thick-framed glasses. The expensive suit and familiar gold watch were removed and placed neatly in a drawer, as if locking away an entire life of luxury. Caleb sat at the desk, picked up an electric razor, and slowly trimmed his beard, each pass of the blade cutting away more than just hair. His hair was dyed back to black, covering the streaks of gray that had once been a badge of maturity. Looking at himself in the mirror, he managed a faint smile, not a smile of triumph, but the resigned smile of a man who had accepted leaving behind the powerful figure he had become to return to where he truly belonged. Before closing the duffel, Caleb's eyes lingered on the gold wedding ring still on his finger. He slid it off carefully and placed it in the drawer next to the watch and financial documents. "Goodbye, Caleb Monroe, the powerful boss. From now on, there is only Kyle Myers, just another ordinary employee," he murmured, his voice low and rough but steady. Outside, the city was still cloaked in darkness, the tall buildings silent in the night. Caleb left the office, locking the door himself, carrying no company phone, no thick binders of reports. In his pocket was only an old leather wallet with a few crumpled bills, a prepared fake name tag, and an unshakable resolve. He drove alone through long, empty streets lit by weak, yellow streetlights. When his car finally stopped in front of store number 12, the place where he had witnessed yesterday's shameful scene, the sky was still a dull gray with the first light of dawn. Caleb turned off the engine, took a deep breath, his hands tightening on the steering wheel before loosening. Tonight, he had truly become someone else. This time, he wouldn't just watch, he would stand in that very place, listen, feel, and change everything with his own hands. even if it meant starting from the very bottom. The door chime rang softly as Caleb pushed open the entrance to store number 12. That sound had once brought him joy back in the early days. Every time a customer walked in, employees would cheerfully call out, "Welcome," and he would smile, greeting each person himself. But now, the sound was nothing more than a bitter reminder of what he had lost. No one looked up, no one offered a greeting, not even a glance of acknowledgement. Caleb stepped inside, keeping his expression neutral so that Kyle Myers would not raise suspicion. The interior was dim under the dull yellow glow of fluorescent lights. The faint smell of burnt butter lingered in the air, mixed with the stale scent of old grease clinging to the floor. Caleb walked slowly, his eyes scanning every corner, noting every small detail. The tables and chairs were haphazardly arranged. Crumbs littered the pastry counter. Sauce containers sat open and abandoned on the shelves. It was the complete opposite of the store he had once built, a place meant to be tidy, organized, warm, like a family kitchen. Behind the counter, Evan Cross stood hunched over a prep table, his head bowed. The young man was so thin that his uniform hung loosely from his narrow shoulders, as if it might slip off at any moment. Dark circles shadowed his sunken eyes, and his hands trembled as he sliced through loaves of bread. Caleb paused in a corner, staying unnoticed, but his gaze locked on the boy. Evan's movements were precise, almost obsessively careful, yet his hands shook so badly the knife kept slipping, leaving uneven cuts he had to fix repeatedly. Caleb recognized that kind of trembling. It wasn't clumsiness, it was exhaustion and fear. A sudden loud noise broke the fragile rhythm. Harlan Briggs burst out of the manager's office, the door slamming against the wall with a sharp thud. He tossed a ring of keys onto the metal counter, the sound echoing harshly through the kitchen, making a few employees flinch. Harlan strode into the room like a predator, his sharp gaze sweeping over everyone before locking onto Evan. "Move faster! Don't keep the customers waiting, understand?" His gravelly voice was as harsh as sandpaper scraping metal. Evan only nodded slightly, not daring to look up. Caleb observed carefully, letting nothing escape his attention. A young woman leaned casually against a counter in the back, tapping rapidly on her phone, occasionally giggling at something she read. Another employee sat slouched in a chair, sneaking bites of bread while scrolling through his screen. No one cared that Evan worked tirelessly alone. No one paid attention to Harlan's barking orders. Caleb watched it all, his chest tightening as if an invisible hand squeezed every nerve in his body. This was no longer his store. This was a place stripped of its soul. Evan quietly slid the tray of bread to the next table, his eyes darting briefly toward the others before dropping instantly, like a reflex born of self-preservation. He seemed to be trying to make himself invisible, to avoid being noticed at all costs. Caleb studied the boy's weary, defeated face, and for a moment he saw the reflection of the young workers who had once stood beside him years ago. People who had believed that hard work and kindness could change their lives. But here, that belief was being buried alive. After a while, Harlan returned, stepping close to the prep table, his gaze scrutinizing Evan like a hawk sizing up its prey. "You planning to crawl all day? That order's been waiting for 10 minutes, he snapped, jerking his head toward the staff chatting idly at the counter. "And you over there, keep working unless you want me to spoon-feed you." A few employees glanced up, half-heartedly putting down their phones, their expressions indifferent. Caleb stood silently in his corner, but every word, every careless glance etched deeper into his mind. As Harlan turned away, Caleb caught a fleeting glimpse of Evan's face. For a split second, a faint glimmer sparked in the boy's gray eyes, only to vanish instantly as he lowered his head again, shoulders trembling as he swallowed the humiliation. Caleb clenched his fists inside his pockets, his nails pressing hard into his palms as he shut his eyes briefly to steady himself. He needed to see more, to listen more, to fully understand what was happening here. But one thing had become crystal clear, as steady and undeniable as the pounding of his heart. No one would have to stand here alone, suffering in silence, ever again. That afternoon, weak sunlight filtered through the frosted glass at the back of the store, casting a pale glow over the small courtyard paved with gray tiles. This was where employees took their brief breaks between shifts, usually just to smoke a cigarette or make a quick phone call. Caleb sat on the low step near the wall, maintaining the calm, unassuming posture of a new hire. Shoulders slightly hunched, eyes averted, every detail carefully crafted so Kyle Myers wouldn't raise suspicion. Evan Cross sat just an arm's length away, his back against the wall, knees pulled tight to his chest, holding a half-open packet of cheap cookies. He broke off tiny pieces, eating slowly, his gaze lost somewhere in the cracks between the tiles. A faint breeze drifted through, carrying the lingering smell of grease from the kitchen. Caleb glanced sideways at him. The boy looked even thinner than yesterday, the sunlight catching the dark circles under his eyes. "How long have you been working here?" Caleb asked, his voice steady and casual, not too friendly but enough to invite an answer. Evan chewed a small bite, shrugged lightly. 3 weeks. I started right after school closed for the summer." He stuffed the piece into his mouth, swallowed quickly, then stared at his worn-out shoes. "I need the money. My mom lost her job and rent's due every week. I'm working nights at the car wash, too." His voice wasn't complaining. It was just a simple statement. But the way his eyes stayed fixed on the ground and his hands crumpled the already wrinkled cookie wrapper made that truth heavier than any words of self-pity. Caleb stayed silent, tapping a finger lightly on the step. He looked at the young man beside him, and for a moment the past surged back. He had once been another Evan, standing in the back of a cramped kitchen, calloused hands dreaming of a better future. And he had believed that by building a place like this, people like Evan would never have to be crushed by indifference. But reality was betraying that dream. "You've never thought of quitting?" Caleb asked quietly, his tone softer now. "Working 2 jobs like this, it's not easy." Evan let out a small laugh, but it was hollow, closer to a sigh than amusement. "I think about it every day. Every morning I wake up, I ask myself why I even come here. But then..." He paused, still staring at his knees. "I can't quit. I just want to do things right, to do a good job. I don't need much. I just need to know I'm not useless." Caleb studied him, something flickering in his gaze, not pity, but respect. A 19-year-old boy, thin, exhausted, yet still holding on because of pride, because of a fragile belief that effort meant something. Caleb drew a deep breath, masking the surge of emotion, keeping Kyle Myers intact. The breeze shifted, making the cookie wrapper slip from Evan's hand. He immediately picked it up, carefully folding it before tucking it back into the bag. That small gesture only confirmed what Caleb already felt: this boy wasn't incompetent. He was simply being buried under a rotting system. Evan was the last remaining spark of the culture Caleb had once dreamed of creating. Another employee pushed open the door, shot them a brief glance, and headed straight to the corner to smoke. Evan instantly recoiled, his posture shrinking, his eyes dropping as if afraid of drawing attention. Caleb glanced at the newcomer, then back at Evan, lowering his voice, firm but calm. "You're not useless." Evan looked up for a moment, surprise flashing briefly in his tired gray eyes, but he only gave a slight nod, as if unsure he'd heard right. The moment passed quickly, but Caleb knew it mattered. For the first time in years, determination burned inside him stronger than ever. He would not let people like Evan be crushed under the name of the company he had built. In his mind, a plan was already taking shape, clear as bricks being set into place. When the break bell rang, Evan stood first, tugging his shirt straight before quickly heading back into the kitchen, his posture still hunched. Caleb watched him go, his eyes growing colder but deeper, like a craftsman silently assessing the very structure he had once built. And he knew that starting today, every rotten brick would be torn down, piece by piece. The air at noon was thick with the smell of hot oil and toasted butter. The clatter of knives and spatulas, the low hum of the toaster, and the muffled voices of customers from the counter blended into a suffocating chaos. Caleb stood by the sink, a pair of tongs in his hand, but his eyes never left Evan, the young man hunched over the prep table, his movements quick yet uncertain, his shoulders pulled tight like a stretched string. Meanwhile, Other employees laughed in the corner. A young girl slouched in a chair, sneaking bites of bread while scrolling through her phone. Their indifference hung heavy in the air like a thick fog, and in the middle of it all, Evan looked like a misplaced shadow. "Cut them evenly, not shred them to pieces. Are you making a salad or putting on a comedy show?" Harlan Briggs's voice cut through the noise like a blade, silencing everything around. He strode out of the manager's office, coffee cup in hand, his mocking eyes sweeping the room before locking on Evan. Evan froze, the knife in his hand slipping for just a second, causing a slice of bread to fall out of place. Caleb tightened his grip on the tongs, a sharp pang rising in his chest, but he stayed silent, his gaze fixed on every move Harlan made. "Hurry it up, we've got 10 orders waiting. Or should I just do it myself?" Harlan's voice carried through the kitchen, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few employees chuckled, glancing briefly at Evan before turning away. Evan's face flushed red, his head dropping lower, his trembling hands picking up the misplaced slice. I'll finish it right away," he mumbled, his voice barely escaping his throat. Caleb pressed the tongs harder, his nails digging slightly into his palm. He had promised himself he would observe, stay patient, but every word from Harlan felt like a blade cutting through him. People like Harlan, their very presence was what killed the spirit of this place. When Evan awkwardly turned to grab another tray, Harlan suddenly snatched the knife off the table, slamming it down hard enough to make a sharp clattering sound. "Let me show you how it's done. If you can even tell the difference between bread and a toy," he sneered, his eyes boring into Evan with malicious amusement. Evan bit his lip, his hands tightening slightly, but he stayed still like a schoolboy caught making a mistake. Caleb had enough. He stepped forward, his voice low but clear. "He just needs more time. That's not how you teach someone." The entire kitchen froze for a moment, some employees looking up, not out of agreement but out of surprise that a new hire would dare to speak. Harlan turned sharply, his eyes narrowing like blades, a smirk curling on his lips.
"Oh, Kyle Myers, right? How long have you even worked here to lecture me? This isn't a classroom, it's a kitchen. You either get it right or you leave." He stepped closer, towering over Caleb, his voice grinding out each word. Caleb stood his ground, his gaze steady and unwavering. In his eyes was a cold sharpness Harlan didn't recognize, but it made the man pause for half a second. "I just think, if you want someone to do better, you should at least give them a chance to get it right," Caleb replied evenly, without a hint of fear. Harlan scoffed, stepping back, crossing his arms. "We don't coddle anyone here. If you can't handle it, you don't belong. Same goes for you." He turned on his heel, heading back to the manager's office, the sound of his shoes tapping against the tiled floor echoing like dry, harsh clicks. Evan stayed frozen in place, his head bowed, his hands gripping the tray so tightly his knuckles turned white. He glanced up at Caleb for a brief second, his tired gray eyes flickering with a spark of gratitude, though mixed with worry. Caleb gave him a small nod, a silent reassurance before returning to his spot. But inside, a storm was already rising. He watched Harlan disappear through the door, his lips pressing together. This time, he wouldn't just stand by. Harlan had grown too used to mistaking cruelty for authority, but real authority wasn't built on trampling others, and Harlan was about to learn that lesson in a way he would never forget. The kitchen that afternoon felt like an oven, the air heavy with the smell of hot oil and toasted butter. The sharp clatter of knives, the hum of the toaster, and the constant shouts of orders blended into a suffocating rhythm. Sweat clung to Evan's forehead as he struggled to keep up with the pace. His hands moved faster than usual, but exhaustion made every motion shaky. Caleb stood a few steps away, pretending to wipe the counter, but his eyes never left the young man. He could see Evan's shoulders tense every time Harlan came near the prep station. Then it happened, a small accident, but enough to shatter the fragile balance. A large container of lettuce slipped from Evan's hands, crashing onto the floor with a loud bang. Crisp green leaves scattered across the tiles, mixing with streaks of sauce spilling from the container.
For a split second, the noise in the kitchen seemed to slow, and then Harlan's voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. "Are you serious, Evan? That's it. I've had enough." Evan dropped to his knees instantly, his trembling hands gathering the fallen leaves, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'll clean it up right away." But Harlan didn't give him a chance. The man strode over, towering above him, blocking the overhead light with his broad frame. "Didn't mean to? You never mean to. I don't need your useless apologies. You're fired. Right now. Pack your things and get out." The entire kitchen went silent. A few employees glanced over, then quickly looked away. Some pretended to stay busy, chopping vegetables as if nothing had happened. Evan stayed frozen on the floor, his shoulders stiff. A handful of lettuce caught midair in his shaking hand. "Please, just one more chance. His voice cracked, trembling, almost swallowed by the tension in the air. Harlan folded his arms, his words loud enough for everyone to hear. "No second chances. I don't pay people to ruin the shift. You're done here. Leave before I call security." He turned sharply, his footsteps pounding on the tiled floor as if the matter meant nothing to him. Evan lowered his head even more, his brown hair falling over his face, hiding whatever expression remained. He carefully set the container aside and continued picking up each leaf, moving with mechanical slowness. Caleb noticed the way his hands shook harder, his knuckles turning white. Evan didn't cry. But that silence, the silence of someone swallowing his pride just to keep standing, was more painful than any tears. Caleb inhaled deeply, his hand tightening around the cloth under the counter, veins standing out against his skin. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding faster, each beat urging him forward. This was it. He had seen enough. This was the breaking point. Evan slowly stood, his head still bowed, his voice barely a whisper. I understand." He placed the tray of salvaged lettuce back on the table, turned, and started walking toward the back door. Caleb watched his retreating figure, thin, frail, yet stubbornly upright, as if held together only by sheer desperation. And he knew, if he stayed silent now, Evan would leave for good, taking with him the last piece of faith in fairness this place had left. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. Caleb dropped the tongs, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet as he stepped forward, slow but deliberate. All eyes turned toward him, drawn by the weight of his movements. He was no longer Kyle Myers, the timid new hire quietly observing in the corner. He was Caleb Monroe, the man who had built this place with his own hands, and he would not let it rot for another second. Evan's hand rested on the kitchen door, ready to push it open, his shoulders still slumped. Caleb's eyes locked on him, cold and resolute, filled with a determination that would change everything from this moment on. Caleb's footsteps echoed steadily across the tiled floor, each step like the beat of a drum urging the entire kitchen into a tense silence. He moved slowly but with purpose, his eyes fixed on Evan's back. In that moment, everything else faded. There was only Evan, the young man forcing himself to walk out through that door like a defeated shadow, and Harlan, the man who had just tossed away a human being as if he were garbage. Caleb stopped in the center of the kitchen, slowly removing the thick glasses from his face and slipping them into his pocket. He took a deep breath, lifting his head, his gaze sharp as a blade as it locked onto Harlan. "Briggs." His voice rang out, low and steady, not loud but clear enough for everyone to hear. Harlan, already halfway to his office, stopped and turned, annoyance etched across his face. "What now, Myers? I don't have time for your whining." Caleb took another step forward, the distance between them closing to just a few feet. "You just fired him in front of everyone." His voice remained calm, but there was weight in every word, enough to make a few employees glance up. Harlan smirked, shrugging dismissively. "So what? I have that right. I have that. This is my kitchen, and I decide who stays and who goes." A cold smile touched Caleb's lips, his eyes flashing with something Harlan couldn't quite recognize, a quiet authority that needed no shouting. Caleb stepped closer, now standing face to face, so close that the tension between them felt almost physical. "No," Caleb said, his voice deliberate, each word like a hammer striking steel. "This isn't your kitchen. This is the company I built, and my name is Caleb Monroe." A ripple of silence spread through the room. Knives stopped chopping. The hum of the toaster ceased. Harlan blinked, instinctively taking a half step back. What did you just say?" he stammered, his voice trembling for just a second. Caleb didn't answer immediately, his piercing gaze forcing Harlan to look away. Somewhere in the kitchen, a young employee dropped a spoon, the clang against the floor sounding like a signal. Evan froze mid-step, his hand still on the kitchen door, his body tense, his eyes wide with disbelief. Caleb's voice was quieter now, but each word struck with the force of a hammer. "I've seen enough. I've heard enough insults, enough indifference, and I won't let anyone destroy what I built with my own 2 hands." Harlan tried to regain his composure, forcing a strained laugh. You can't be serious. Even if you are who you say you are, you can't just—" Caleb cut him off with a look so sharp it silenced him instantly. "I am serious. As of now, you're no longer the manager here. Take off your apron, hand over your keys, and leave this kitchen." The silence that followed was heavy. Harlan stood frozen, his face flushing with anger and confusion. He opened his mouth to protest, but no one spoke up for him. For the first time in months, the other employees looked not with fear, but with hope. Maria, one of the longest-standing staff, allowed herself a small smile, subtle but undeniable. Harlan glanced around, searching for support, but was met only with averted eyes. The pressure was suffocating. Gritting his teeth, he yanked off his apron, slammed the keys onto the counter, and stormed out. The door banged loudly against the wall, but no one reacted. Caleb took a slow breath, turning his gaze toward Evan. The young man still stood frozen, his arms hanging loosely by his sides, his eyes wide with shock. Caleb walked over, his voice steady but warm. "Evan, you're not fired. You're staying. I've seen how hard you've worked, and that effort matters more than perfection." Evan looked up, his pale gray eyes shimmering, though no tears fell. He simply nodded, his hand tightening slightly as if gripping the fragile hope he'd just been given. Caleb nodded back. True power, he thought, was never about crushing others. True power was giving them the chance to stand tall again. And today, he had done exactly that. The kitchen sank into an unusual quiet after Harlan left, a silence that felt like the first breath after months of suffocating tension. No one spoke, but the air seemed lighter, as if an invisible weight had finally been lifted. Caleb didn't speak immediately either. He took a slow breath, bent down, and picked up the apron lying crumpled on the floor. His movements were calm, deliberate, but the message was clear. Everything had to start over, beginning with the smallest things. He tied the apron around his waist, rolled up his sleeves, and walked to the corner of the kitchen where grease had collected thickly beneath the counters. A mop lay abandoned nearby, its handle tilted against the wall. Caleb picked it up, adjusted the grip, and began cleaning, each stroke firm and precise, reaching into every neglected corner. A few employees exchanged uncertain glances, confused. None of them had ever seen a leader stoop down to do something like this. Maria, the woman with streaks of gray at her temples, stood nearby holding a tray of pastries. She watched Caleb for a long moment, her lips twitching into the faintest trace of a smile. Without a word, she set the tray down, grabbed another mop, and started cleaning near the counter. Like a ripple spreading through water, other employees began to join in, one by one putting aside their phones and idle chatter. Caleb glanced at Maria as she quietly worked in the corner, his expression softening. "Maria, how long have you been here?" he asked, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. Maria looked up, slightly surprised, then replied, 9 years, since the day you used to bake at this very counter." Caleb nodded, and for the first time in days, a genuine smile touched his face. "I need someone who understands this place, who understands the people here. I want you to be the new shift lead. Will you take it?" Maria hesitated for only a moment, and in her eyes, once dulled by fatigue, a spark flickered to life. "I remember how things used to be. If you're serious about bringing that back—" "Yes, I will." Caleb's gaze was steady, his voice firm. "Not if. We will." The sound of knives chopping returned, but this time with rhythm, no longer lazy or careless. Caleb kept scrubbing under the refrigerator, occasionally glancing at Evan. The young man remained quiet, but his eyes were no longer clouded, and his hands gripped the knife with a steadier confidence. Caleb knew all Evan needed was a chance, and he would prove his worth. When things had settled, Caleb removed the apron, washed his hands, and stepped into the center of the kitchen where everyone was still tidying up. "Listen carefully," his voice carried evenly, low but filled with resolve. "I won't let this place go back to the way it was. Starting tomorrow, we change the way we work. Everyone here will have a voice and everyone will share responsibility. No more fear, no more indifference." A young employee spoke hesitantly. "What about new hires? We've been short-staffed for months." Caleb nodded. "I've already contacted Marcus, someone with experience and integrity. He'll be here Monday. From now on, we're not just filling shifts fast, we're choosing people willing to do things right." Maria looked at him, her voice quiet but firm. "I think some people won't adapt to this right away." Caleb met her gaze, his tone serious but warm. "I know, but I didn't build this place for people to get used to apathy." That night, after the store closed, Caleb stayed behind. He crouched down, scrubbing away layers of grease under the stove, polishing until the tiles reflected the dim overhead light. Maria passed by and paused beside him. "It's been a long time since I've seen someone smile while cleaning a kitchen," she said softly, her voice carrying a trace of relief. Caleb looked up, smiling, tired but resolute. "Some things never leave you, Maria. They just wait for the right moment to come back." Maria walked away, her steps lighter than before. Caleb kept working in silence, his focus unwavering. He knew this was only the beginning. Rebuilding a house starts with laying each brick one by one, and tonight, the first brick had been set in place. 3 days later, the atmosphere in the restaurant was completely different. The gray walls and worn wooden tables were the same, but the way people moved had changed faster, more focused, no more careless laughter or distracted glances at the clock. Caleb stood at the counter, flipping patties on the grill, but his eyes stayed on Evan. He wanted to see with his own eyes what he already believed would happen. The young man who once kept his head down would now stand tall in front of everyone. Evan stood at the service counter wearing gloves, his gray eyes focused on the order slip in front of him. A young woman carrying a toddler stepped up, her face showing fatigue. "Sorry, can you make sure there's no onion in my burger? My son is allergic." Her voice held a trace of worry. Evan looked up, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't look away. He gave a small, reassuring smile and spoke with quiet confidence. "Don't worry, I'll make sure of it. No onions, and I'll double-check before I hand it to you." The woman looked momentarily surprised, then smiled gratefully. As she turned away, the toddler tugged at Evan's sleeve. He bent slightly, handing the child a napkin to wipe his hands, his expression gentle and genuine. From his spot across the kitchen, Caleb's eyes softened. This was the spirit the place had once been built on, small acts of kindness that changed a customer's entire experience. Later, Evan returned to the prep station, his movement surer, his hands steady, no longer trembling. Caleb stepped closer, pretending to inspect the tray of buns, his voice low but warm. "Good job." Evan looked up briefly, surprise flickering in his eyes before he focused back on his task, the corners of his mouth lifting in the faintest smile. During the lunch break, Caleb sat on the steps behind the restaurant, and this time, he wasn't alone. Evan sat beside him, holding a glass of water instead of the cheap pack of cookies he used to eat. He was quiet for a few seconds before speaking. "I used to think maybe I wasn't cut out for this job. Every day I just wanted to quit." Caleb tilted his head slightly, saying nothing, only watching him. Evan tightened his grip on the glass, his voice lower now. "But today I don't think that anymore. I'm not perfect, but at least I feel like I did something right." Caleb looked straight at him, and for the first time in days, a rare smile touched his face. "You don't have to be perfect, Evan. You just need to keep doing exactly this, doing the right thing, one step at a time. That's what matters most." Evan gave a small nod, his gray eyes looking into the distance, but this time there was no hint of defeat in them. Instead, there was something steadier, like a small flame that had just been reignited. That afternoon, as the counter grew busier, Caleb stood in his usual spot, observing. Evan moved quickly, calling out orders clearly, his expression calm. A busy customer accidentally handed him the wrong amount of change, and Evan immediately returned it with a quick joke that made the man laugh. Caleb nodded slightly, a quiet sense of pride rising in his chest, as if he were watching a fragile seed push through the soil after a long storm. At closing, Evan stayed behind to help Maria clean up. He didn't notice Caleb standing at the end of the counter, watching him with quiet, thoughtful eyes. The young man who had once been pushed to the brink was now standing firm on his own. This wasn't just Evan's transformation. It was the first sign of the restaurant's rebirth. Caleb took a deep breath as he stepped outside, his chest feeling lighter. But he knew the work wasn't over. Restoring the spirit was only the first step. Now he had to build a system strong enough so that no one here would ever have to bow their head in fear again. That evening, after the restaurant had closed, the warm yellow light cast soft reflections on the freshly cleaned tile floor. The hum of the air conditioner blended with the steady rhythm of Maria's broom as she finished the last sweep. Caleb stood alone by the prep counter, a rag in his hand, quietly scrubbing away the last streaks of oil until the stainless steel gleamed under the lights. He didn't need to do this. He could have told someone else to handle it, but tonight he chose to do it himself, just as he had done on the very first day he built this place. Maria walked by carrying a stack of washed trays. She paused, tilting her head to look at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. A smile Caleb hadn't seen on her face in a long time. "You know," her voice was quiet but sincere, "it's been a long time since I've seen someone smile while cleaning a kitchen." Caleb looked up, his smile soft and a little tired, but his eyes brighter than ever. "Some things never really leave you, Maria. They just wait for the right time to come back." Maria didn't respond, only nodded, and went back to her work, her steps noticeably lighter. When everyone else had left, Caleb stayed behind. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, set it on the counter, and opened it to the first page. Under the warm yellow light, he wrote slowly, each stroke firm and deliberate. "Store pulse day 1. Evan stayed 10 minutes late to help clean the kitchen. Maria managed the evening shift smoothly. The atmosphere is better. People are starting to work like a team." He paused for a moment, smiling as he remembered the focused look in Evan's eyes while serving customers, and that awkward but genuine smile when he was praised. Small changes, but meaningful. This is how you start over. The sound of soft footsteps came from the back door. Maria stood there, holding a ring of keys, watching him. "You don't have to do everything yourself, Caleb. You have an entire management team. You can run things from an office like before." Caleb looked up, his gaze steady but warm. "I know, but I've been away too long. I built this place for the people, not for the numbers. I need to stand here myself, to remember why I started." Maria looked at him for a long moment, then smiled gently. "Then welcome back, boss." Caleb didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, closed the notebook, slipped it into his pocket, and followed Maria to the door. The back door closed with a soft click, not the harsh slam it had made when Harlan left, but the quiet sound of a new chapter beginning. The next morning, when Caleb walked into the store wearing a simple shirt and the name tag Kyle Myers still pinned to his chest, the atmosphere felt different. Evan was wiping the counter, and when he heard the bell over the door, he looked up, hesitated slightly, then smiled a real smile, more genuine than any he had shown in days. Caleb returned it with a slow but certain nod, a silent promise. "You're not invisible here anymore." He walked past the counter, pulling on his apron, preparing for another workday just like any other employee. But this time, everything was different. Because now, everyone in the kitchen could feel the change, not a change that came from orders, but from someone standing beside them, working with them, listening to them. As Caleb passed by, Evan spoke quietly, his voice small but full of meaning. "Thank you for seeing me." Caleb paused for a moment, only nodded, saying nothing. He didn't need to. In that moment, he knew he had done the right thing. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning, not just for a company, but for the people working under his name. Caleb tightened the knot of his apron and returned to the counter, the rhythmic sound of knives and cutting boards mixing with the soft laughter of the staff. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was home. In business, success is not measured only by revenue, but by how we treat the people who build it every single day. Caleb Monroe proved something simple yet powerful. The right acknowledgement at the right time can save a person, and in doing so, save the very soul of a company. If you believe that respect and kindness are the true strengths of any business, hit like and subscribe so we can continue sharing inspiring stories like this. And don't forget to leave a comment with the words "believe in people," because that is exactly where every change begins.